Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I'm Ben DeBono and I'm very excited to talk to you about Blade Runner 2049. I saw this last night. I saw it in IMAX, which is what I recommend you do if you have the opportunity in your area to see this in the big format. I know there's some other ones that I don't know what the deal is with IMAX in terms of how proprietary that label is, because I know like around here we have the monster screen at a couple theaters and I haven't been to any of the monster screens, so I don't know what the difference is between that and IMAX. But suffice to say, find the biggest screen you can, whether it's labeled IMAX or not, and go see this. This is an absolutely stunning piece of work. It's a gorgeous film, and it needs to be seen in the theater. It's going to be great when we all get it on Blu-ray or 4K or whatever you have, and you can watch it at home, but see this in the theater for sure. I'm going to keep the first few minutes of this spoiler-free, so like I did with my review of Mother, I will put in the description the timestamp for where I launch into spoilers. But if you haven't seen it yet and you just kind of want to know a couple of very general, because I am going to be as vague as possible about this, things about this movie, then you stick around here at the beginning, but then please leave before the spoiler section, because this is a movie that you need to let unfold for you in the way that it presents itself. Don't spoil it for yourself. I've in the past been critical of spoiler warnings because I think it gets a little overwrought, but in this case it's really not so much that, if you know this plot point, the whole thing's going to just be a horrible experience for you. No. There's no big Bruce Willis is a ghost twist at the end of this. It's more just that this is a movie where the experience of letting it unfold for you is part of the wonder that it evokes, and I don't want you to miss out on that by having it spoiled for you. So a couple of things. First of all, if you have not seen the original Blade Runner, or you haven't seen it recently, you absolutely need to watch it before you go watch this. I would recommend watching the final cut, but to be honest, as long as there is some familiarity with the material, you're going to be in good shape. So watch or rewatch Blade Runner. This movie is very dependent upon a lot of the plot from that movie. That brings me to kind of the main thing I want to discuss in this spoiler-free section, which is that this is a movie that should not work. I'm just like so many other people, and if you listen to the podcast, you know this very well, that I'm so sick of these cheap nostalgia grabs that come out, and it seems like we're just hell-bent on every single semi-famous property from the 80s and 90s is going to be rebooted or have a sequel done to it. And the drill. Everything from the X-Files to Fuller House to Star Wars is the most prominent example. And this should be one of those movies where it's like Blade Runner isn't just a sci-fi classic, it's a classic. I think it's in the 70s on the Sight and Sound Top 250, so it ranks very high, even put up against non-sci-fi films. And you do a sequel to that 35 years later, and this should be the type of thing where you come out and you shrug your shoulders and say, well, I guess if you're a fan of the original, maybe there's some nostalgic value, but it's not something that's necessarily worth your time. But that's completely the opposite case. If every one of these nostalgic cash-in projects was like this, no one would be complaining about them, because this is how it's done right. And to illustrate that, without getting into spoilers, I'm going to contrast this with The Force Awakens, which is not the most egregious example of nostalgia whoring, if we can call it that, but it's probably the most famous. The Force Awakens is fine. I didn't hate the movie. I saw it 3 times in the theaters, and I haven't had any desire to go back and rewatch it since. It's a fine movie. But it's a movie where, assuming you've seen it, and everybody's seen it, it's one that completely regurgitates what's come before, especially in the second half of that movie. I mean, by the time Starkiller Base shows up, it's very obvious what we're doing. We're essentially remaking A New Hope. And my biggest complaint with The Force Awakens was that it did not build on what came before. it did not build. Return of the Jedi has this great promise that the Jedi are returning, and the Empire is destroyed, and now the New Republic is going to take over, and there's this curiosity of what's going to happen next, and for all the flaws is what I was trying to say. I think I combined that and faults. Of all the faults, I'll just go with it, of the expanded universe novels, they actually did that. They had a sense of here's what happens next in this story. And The Force Awakens has no interest in doing that. The Force Awakens is a movie where you don't have to have seen the original trilogy to enjoy it. And that's kind of the point of that one. It's interested in regurgitating the past. It evokes the originals in order to repeat them. Not Blade Runner 2049. It evokes the original in order to tell the next story. And this goes through at every single level of the film. From the cinematography, Blade Runner is a noir. It's shot that way. It's, Matt and I just did a podcast on Blade Runner, which you can go check out. I'll try and remember to put the link to that below here on the original film. We did this episode, and we talked a lot about film noir and Blade Runner's place in that. And it's completely shot like a film noir. It's Chinatown in a futuristic city, essentially. And everything from the lighting to the fact that, especially except for the original cut with the original happy ending, I don't think we ever leave the city once in Blade Runner. To the hard-boiled nature of Deckard and all of this stuff, it's all film noir all the way through. Well, this movie has moments that definitely evoke film noir, moments where it goes in that direction, and it feels like we are in a visual continuity with the original, but it's not a film noir. And it's similar to how somebody could shoot a film noir in New York City, but you could also shoot a drama in New York City. And that's what the comparison is. It evokes that original look and feel, but it never feels bound by it. The music is the same way. There's only one point in the movie, I think, and I would want to go back and double check this claim, but there's only one point in the movie where the Vangelis, or Vangelis, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, but where the original Vangelis score is directly played. Other than that, the soundtrack consistently has that feel to it, but it doesn't repeat it. And it's wonderful. Thematically, this feels like a continuation of the conversation about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean, to what extent does it matter if somebody's a replicant or not a replicant, and how much of a difference should that make? But also really in expanding the world of Blade Runner, because we do go outside the city, outside of Los Angeles, for a good chunk, if not most of this movie is set not directly in Los Angeles. And to again pile on Star Wars a little bit, or Disney Wars as I like to call the current iteration, there's this sense with all of these spin-offs that as they're expanding the world, they're not really expanding the world, they're just over-explaining elements of the original world. There's an anthology series that just came out for Disney Wars called From a Certain Point of View, and it's just all, every little moment of different characters, like some stormtrooper in A New Hope, we learn about his love life, and it's just, the one who went into investigate the Millennium Falcon and got beat up by Han and Chewie, and it's like, it's that type of thing. Or we're going to do Rogue One, where we make an entire movie out of a single line in the first movie, and then we have to go to familiar places, and we have to have familiar people to show up, and even when we have a new planet like Jakku, it's really just Tatooine by a different name, and it's that sense. It's like Disney Wars is not expanding the Star Wars universe. It's regurgitating it and over-explaining things. That's not the case here. This is an expansion, and it's expansion in continuity, and it's absolutely glorious. The plot, I'm not going to say a single thing about in this spoiler-free section, just because even the most basic plot description is a spoiler. You don't want that. Just let it unfold before you. The cast is wonderful, and I hate Ryan Gosling. And at first in this movie, he wasn't working for me, but then the movie solved that problem for me as it went on, which happened on a number of occasions. Maybe I'll get into a couple of those on the spoiler section, where I had a problem with something the movie was doing, and then within 20-30 minutes it resolved itself. And it did that for me again and again and again. In terms of any critiques I would have of this, there's really a few minor things. The antagonists are fairly underdeveloped, and that's less the case with Jared Leto's character as it is with kind of his replicant henchman, or henchwoman in this case, where she just has no depth to her character at all, which is a shame because the depth of the replicants in every other area of these two films is one of the highlights of how human they feel, and she's essentially just a Terminator. And so that's a little disappointing, and she's not a great character, and I wish they would have rounded that out. So that's probably my biggest criticism of it, but it's also, I feel like I'm nitpicking even with that, although it is valid. There's a few plot points that I would want to watch the film again and kind of look at and say, okay, did that really resolve itself? Or was that a plot hole? Or, you know, it's a complicated plot in places, so there's a few things that I'm not too sure about after a first viewing, just in terms of did they actually connect that properly, or that type of thing. But nothing that spoiled the movie for me. The main plot relies on one massive coincidence. I am going to talk about that in the spoiler section. But I think it kind of works. It definitely works thematically. It's a leap in terms of the plot, and you have to give the movie that. But if you give the movie that one moment, the rest of the plot works brilliantly. So, I'm going to get into spoilers here in a second, but please go see this. I love this movie. I want to talk about it more. This, you know, like I said, I saw it last night, and so this is really my less than 24 hours later thoughts. But this is a movie where when you sit with it and see it again, it's going to be a movie that unveils new things. I'm going to have more things to say about it later on, and hopefully years down the road. This is a great film. Roger Deakins should hopefully finally win his Oscar for it. If he doesn't, he ought to lose to Dunkirk, because there's no other movies that I'm aware of this year that even come remotely close to the cinematography of these two. Denis Villeneuve, I think that's how he pronounces his name, is maybe the best director working today, or if not the best, definitely top 2 or 3. I can't wait to see what he does with Dune, assuming that he does go forward with that plot. He is just, everything he touches is gold. I love Prisoners. I loved Enemy. I really liked Sicario and Arrival, though to a lesser degree than those first two. And this movie's right up there with Prisoners and Enemy. I haven't seen any of his French work yet, and I need to go check that out. He is at the top of his game, and he did the impossible. He made a sequel to a movie that no sequel should ever work to. So my hat off to him and everybody involved with this. It's A+ work. All right, spoiler time. So I'm waving my arms here. You are in spoiler territory for this from here on out. Again, if you have not seen this movie, please turn this off. I want you to see it unspoiled. And if you're saying, "Oh, well, I'm going to watch because I don't think I'm ever actually going to see it," just go see it. Don't spoil this for yourself. Okay. So let's talk about a couple things in terms of the plot. I want to start with that coincidence I was talking about, which is the fact that Agent K, or Blade Runner K, or I forget what his title is, Ryan Gosling's character has this memory implanted in him. Now, it turns out to not be his memory, of course, but the fact that, to me, he had that memory implanted in him, and he is the one who who is the Blade Runner who takes out Dave Bautista's character at the beginning and kind of starts this whole thing, is a very big jump. Like, that's a huge coincidence. I was glad that he didn't turn out to be the child, because that would have been even more so. You know, I could buy the idea that maybe he's not the only one who has this memory out there. That's a possibility, that they had implanted it into multiple replicants and hope that one person like Kay would find would be the one who stumbles on this and be able to put the pieces together, but that doesn't quite work because they seem determined to hide, and there isn't a desire for them to be found or for somebody to put the pieces together. So if there's something in that direction in the film, I missed it on the first viewing. But that's a big coincidence, but you give it that, and the rest of the movie works brilliantly. Here's what I loved about the plot. The first Blade Runner is a small story, okay? It's Deckard is hunting down these 4 replicants, and he does his job, and he falls in love and goes on the run, and the movie ends. And maybe he's a replicant, maybe he's not. And that's it. You know, it's set against this massive backdrop of starships on fire off of Orion, as Roy Batty talks about at the end. But it's not about those things. This movie is in constant danger of losing that focus because it's expanding the world. It's expanding the scope. Everything is bigger in this sequel, and when sequels do that, it usually goes badly because there's this sense of we want to ramp everything up. And this movie doesn't do that, and it's so great because the bait is constantly there. Like, Jared Leto's character, Wallace, keeps talking about what he wants to do with all of these replicants, and he wants to build an army, and then we meet the Resistance, and they want to build an army, and like there's this massive, big budget, dumb sci-fi movie that is constantly threatening to break into this thing, and the movie doesn't go there. And it's wonderful. Now, I could see if this is really successful, the studio comes along and they actually tell that story, and it would be dumb. I mean, it's possible that it could be well done. But I hope they don't, because that's not the type of world and not the type of stories that Blade Runner is about. And just the courage, and I don't know what went on in writers' rooms, and I don't know what went on with the studio talks, but you can just see the studio notes in your head of, like, with the Resistance scene, where it's one scene. There's a few other ancillary things connected to it, but it's one scene, and you can see the studio note, let's do more of this, let's have the battle, and the courage to not go there, and on the part of the filmmakers, and my hats are off to them. Like, this could have been one of those things where you walk out and you're like, well, that third act battle was really cool, but it's empty, and that's not the case. This is the story of Deckard and his child, and his surrogate son in Agent K. And it's brilliant. I love the fact that the plot doesn't rehash the original, which very could have easily have done, because we have a new Blade Runner, we have a new generation of Blade Runners, and you could have seen it doing the Force Awakens thing, and it honestly would have fit with this movie, and they don't do that. You know, or the Terminator 2 thing, where this time we're hunting Nexus 8s, and they have all these extra powers and all that. And I'm not trying to bag on Terminator 2, which is probably the one example of remaking the original movie with a sequel that actually does it very well. But it doesn't do that. It tells its own story. Now, if you do want to see this as something of a repetition of the plot in the movie, that actually becomes a really interesting way to look at this, because you could see that this is the story of the original told from Roy Batty's perspective. That Agent K is essentially in the Roy Batty position. And it's wonderful because if you look at it that way, which you don't have to, like, the movie doesn't force that on you, but it makes you think about the original in new ways. And this is a sequel that makes the original better, which is just fantastic. I love that this isn't Deckard's movie, which is so great. I mean, Harrison Ford is wonderful in it, but it's not his movie. This is not his story. I love that the mystery of whether or not Deckard is a replicant or not is preserved, and that makes it even better. Like, is this child special because it's the first time 2 replicants have reproduced, or is it the child special because replicants and humans have reproduced? And either one of those just sets your imagination on fire in 2 different directions, and thematically works either way. And the movie is just spot on, so great with that. I love the way that, and I alluded to this in the spoiler-free section, of how we expand the world without showing more, or without just regurgitating elements from the original, or over-explaining stuff from the original. And a great example of that is all the scenes in the pyramids with Wallace. And if they were doing this in kind of the Disney Wars fashion, how this would have worked is that we would have a scene in Tyrell's bedroom that we briefly saw in the original, but now we go in there and we see all this other stuff, and we learn so many more things about Tyrell. They don't do that. We're in the pyramids, and we see cool stuff, and we see more of them, but we see it for the purpose of the story that's being told, not to over-explain something and not to shrink the world by expanding it, which I know sounds like a contradiction, but if you watch the beginning part of this, you know what I mean by that. And it's just so good. It's so good. The cinematography is great. The character of Joy worked so well, and she introduces that same level of how human is she, and it takes this same dynamic of replicants versus humans, and then we have replicants versus holograms, and we have this continuum now that this series has established in terms of humanity, but humanity continues to reassert itself, and it's just wonderful. I'm just stunned by how well this movie works. I had high hopes for it, and it surpassed it. Another example of that expanding the world while still not ruining it along the way is the way that it leaves ambiguity even in expanding the world. I love the fact that we never find out what radioactive thing happened to Las Vegas. Or if we did, I missed it, because it's that brief. I love that. It's just something happened to Las Vegas. Something radioactive happened there. And we don't know what it is. And it's great. And just the way that every location has its own distinctive look. This is a masterpiece of a film. And like the original, I don't want a sequel to it. Unless somebody like Denis Villeneuve comes along and he does the same thing with Blade Runner 2079 or whatever it would be. But I hope they don't do a sequel, because they caught lightning in a bottle here. Just leave it. Don't do Godfather Part 3. I'm stunned by how good this movie is. As far as the best movie I've seen that was made this year, it's going to come down to this and Dunkirk. I don't know which one I would choose at the moment. There's probably other movies out there that ought to be in that conversation that I'm not aware of or haven't seen, so I'm not trying to limit it to just those two. But in terms of what I have seen that was made this year, it's those two, and nothing else even comes close. There is no competition beyond these two movies. As far as how it stacks up against the original, because I know people are talking about that, to me that's a meaningless question at this point. The original is a classic, and it's had 35 years to ingratiate itself to us, to live in our subconscious, to work its way into culture and pop culture, and this is a movie that came out yesterday. So there's no comparison at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes a classic in its own right. Until it does, there's no point in making that comparison. But I love both movies. I love them in different ways because they're different movies. I love that this isn't a regurgitation. I love the cinematography. I love the story. I love the acting. Outside of those few nitpicks I mentioned earlier, it's a flawless work. And yeah, those few things could have been a little better, and that's fine. But that would have just bumped it up from a 98 to a 99 or something. It's that good. It's a movie I want to see again. I want to think more about, but initial thoughts, this is a masterpiece. It's the movie of the year. Go see it. Hopefully you have seen it. If you're still watching at this point, go see it again. I want to see it again. Encourage people to go see it, because this was an expensive movie. We need it to make money, because otherwise we're just going to get Transformers 78, and we don't want... The studios took a risk here by letting it be rated R, by giving it $150 million, by letting Denis Villeneuve do his vision unencumbered, by letting it not be this regurgitation. We need to support this. This is a movie that needs to make money so that we can get more things like this. This is what I wish Episode 7 had been like. That wonderful continuation that honors the past but goes forward from it. And it's not. And I hate that, but I'm so glad we have this. So, that's all for now. I love this movie. I hope you did too. But this is Ben DeBono for the Sci-Fi Christian.